nationalise the commanding heights. What are the commanding heights of an economy? Well, the commanding heights is a Marxist principle that says that certain industries, certain natural resources, certain public utilities, certain major energy and banking and steel and so forth industries are fundamentally, strategically the most important, and also are where the overwhelming economic activity exists in the society. So Britain, believe it or not, used to live under a society where you could argue to a large degree the commanding heights were to a large extent commonly owned through a system, through a nationalisation programme. They were public utilities. Now, the way that nationalisation happened in the United Kingdom is not what I would consider to any degree really a communist or a socialist society, and I can explain why. They were arm's length. They were public companies, but they were not controlled by workers through a system of councils, and they were not controlled even by government through government planners to a significant degree. They were run kind of at arm's length. There was a government minister responsible for the industry, and the minister would set the board and so forth, and they had a general public interest requirement, but they were not run completely democratically with a system of councils that would be made up of workers, citizens, trade unions and so forth. They were not run in that fashion. They were run in a hierarchical, top-down even though they had things like marginal cost pricing and so forth, but they were not run like a planned democratic society, or at least not to the extent that I would consider a true communist or socialist society. Nonetheless, it was still far better than the disaster that's happened in the past 45 years in Britain, where the neoliberal paradigm has taken over and the idea of regulation and nationalisation has been pushed aside, and we've privatised everything. So now we have deregulation, privatisation, and the catastrophic consequences of handing many of these industries, these natural monopolies that only would have one supplier because of the cost to enter. The market would be so high, to have alternative water suppliers and electric suppliers. It's not really a market economy in that sense. These industries should be monopolised and should be nationalised to a large extent. They should. And we used to live under a society that had many of the commanding heights. This is in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then Thatcher and New Labour privatised everything. We had British Gas, British Petroleum, that was privatised in I believe the late 70s, British Rail, British Steel, British Leyland, the truck making, British Shipbuilding, British, we had the Electricity Board, now we have like the National Grid, we had National Coal, the Royal Mail, British Airways, Rolls-Royce, British Telecom. The major public utilities, the Bank of England even, that was, it's quasi-private now, really it is in reality still nationalised, I would say. The major public utilities, the major natural resources, the major energy and manufacturing networks were largely owned under public companies at arm's length, but the profit was at least shared with the taxpayers, and we could invest that profit back into the system and not be paying for fat cat shareholder profits. Now we have a system of privatisation where many of those commanding heights, what I would call commanding heights, are passed over to private companies and are run without a requirement for the general interest. Their interest is to make profit for shareholders. That's the main interest. And we live in a society of disastrous consequences of that. We have no control over them, or limited control to the extent that we can control them through legislation, like regulations and so forth, but these are private companies. The profits that they make are, there's no requirement to reinvest them. We're paying for massive fat cat shareholder dividends that are to the billions. So Shell, BP, you know, Virgin Media, flipping Sky, Tesco's, and all these, which, and now I would actually argue that the commanding heights now are not just those companies that I've mentioned, or those industries. They are also, because of technology and the financialisation of the economy, and you know, now the commanding heights now would be basically the top 200 companies in Britain, where the vast majority of economic activity occurs. So that would include companies like Tesco, Virgin, Sky, Amazon. These are now the commanding heights, as well as, because, you know, British Steel is not the same company that it was. Now it's run by an Indian company. I think it's Tata Steel. You know, the way that we've moved away from manufacturing and we've moved to kind of technology and finance and service economy. So of course the commanding heights, where most of the activity occurs, has changed. So you could think of it as the biggest companies in Britain. And we should, in my honest opinion, nationalise them. That's one of the first things we should do if we get a communist or socialist government. It's the first step to transferring the whole of society into a communist system. And they would be run not at arm's length, they would be run with a plan. We would set a plan democratically through a system of councils throughout Britain that you'd be a part of. And we would run them, and the council will be made up of trade bodies, obviously British public, workers, and we would democratically plan society in some fashion through a system of councils in the way that it should occur under a democratically planned society. That's basically what I think should happen. Now, we could start by just nationalising energy, you know, the big six energy firms. We could take them under nationalisation, but the way it would occur under Labour or Tory government nationalisation is not as I've just described. It's not completely democratic, and it's not completely in the general interest, and it's not completely to an agreed plan. Now, the consequences of the privatisation of society, because these commanding heights are now privatised basically, is disastrous. We have rising costs that outstretch inflation, because they can set the price to essentially, other than a few regulators like Ofgem, and so forth, they can basically set the price to what they want. We're not in control of them, so we can't implement any type of overall plan for how we want production to occur and to meet the needs of society. We're stuck with the market and what they essentially want to do, based upon how much profit they think they can derive from the industry and what they think customers will also want. But it's not the same as a true planned system under a real communist style system where we survey people and we allocate based upon need. Furthermore, the profits are not properly shared with society. Profits go to the shareholders, the vast majority of them. They have massive pay ratios. The CEO might be on 300 times that of the lowest worker. So the profit is not shared and reinvested properly. It's put into fat cat shareholder profits. We have worse services because they're not properly invested in, and because it's a fake market as well. Even if there is any benefits to a market, and there are some benefits to using the market, there are some communists and socialists that believe we shouldn't have a planned system, a largely planned system, but we should have a largely market economy. But the ownership of firms should be social. It should be a combination of cooperatives, some nationalised and owned by everyone, and some owned by the individual workers that make them up, like a cooperative. I agree that that would be a better society than the one we live in now, absolutely. But I can't stop believing that we need to largely move to a planned society and produce for use and not profit. And I can't see how a society that still has the profit motive and competition with firms and expansion and market share, I can't see how that society could be properly controlled in a true plan, and move to a true communist style society if we maintain a largely market economy. Maybe it would be a combination of a large, for the basic goods and the key goods of society, they would be nationalised, if you will, not nationalised under the things that happens now, but nationalised under a communist style system, and maybe only some luxury goods and non-important goods would be put to a market of some degree. But fundamentally, the way society is run now is a total disaster for everyone. We can't produce what we really need. We produce for profit, which is highly wasteful. We spend billions of pounds of money on Madison Avenue, trying to get people to buy Nike trainers, Adidas trainers, Gucci handbags, fast fashion, and all this. We could make people passive consumers. That's the whole purpose of advertising, to disinform consumers, to make them want things they don't really want. And so the idea that is a healthy society is farcical, ridiculous. There's an unbelievable waste and economic activity with all these sales managers in competition with each other, all these firms in competition with each other, all the marketing in competition with each other, that under a largely planned society would not have to significantly exist. So we should, there's no question about it, that all these previously nationalised industries, I remember the Royal Mail was sold off within my lifetime. The Royal Mail was sold off when I was probably about 20 years old. It was only about 10 years ago. And the Royal, to privatise that, something that had been owned for years and years and years, and run in the public interest, even if it had faults, is just insane. And now we see even though I like the Royal Mail, we see the workers that are treated like crap by their bosses, that see them as simply wage slaves, that see them simply as a tool that will make them profit. It's just insane that we would hand over our core industry to private companies, which basically means no control, less investment, and less profits that are shared back into the system by everyone for the taxpayer. It is a disgrace to society, and fundamentally New Labour accelerated this programme of privatisation. They accelerated the whole private finance initiatives, where we used private companies to produce schools and public works. We used private companies that are now cash strapping councils because the contracts were a total disgrace. And when we build a hospital, because the private company put some of the money forward to do it, the council has to pay that private company, that big contractor, for 30 years, which would cost millions and millions more than it actually cost them to make it. So it's a total disaster for the public purse, the private finance initiatives. Why do we not have a public contractor? Why is all our construction done by thousands of private companies? It's insane. It is absolute inefficient madness. That's what it is, and it's totally undemocratic. And it's not overall helping us as a society. It's not making our lives better having these private companies stomp around the globe, stomp around the country, competing with one another. We need to take back the public utilities, take back the rail, take back the buzz network, take back banks. Now, again, the banks, the financialisation of the economy is a total disgrace, and the whole commercialisation and financialisation of the economy should be completely reversed. So we won't require that many banks, essentially. We should have a public banking system. Of course, the Bank of England should be nationalised, of course it should. But our major natural resources, like British Petroleum, British Gas, the electricity network and so forth, of course they should be nationalised. However, we should also largely move to, where we can, a renewable society where we use things like hydropower, wind and so forth, solar power, to meet our energy demands. But you would hope under a communist socialist society we would not be using as much electricity, gas and so forth, because for a start we wouldn't be producing as much, because when we move to a planned society we would not require 50 leather jackets, 20 pairs of jeans a year, 20 different trainers. We would not require as much production. We wouldn't require, the amount. We wouldn't have people living in huge, massive mansions that is completely over the top and unnecessary for what you need as a human being. We would settle democratically what people agree would be a fair salary and fair labour vouchers. We would have work would be largely equalised, so work would be completely democratic. When you go to work, you'd elect management, whether it's a public company or whether it's a cooperative company. You would elect management. You would also vote for policies. You'd vote for pay. You'd vote for how long you work. You'd vote for all them types of things. You would be able to work from home if your job permitted it. You'd be able to set the hours that you work. You would only be working about 15 to 20 hours a week unless you wanted to work more. Maybe for duration of work you would earn more labour vouchers. If you wanted to work above your democratically set minimum, which we might agree is 20 hours a week, say, if you wanted to earn a few more labour vouchers, then you could work more. And if you wanted to, that would mean spending less time doing leisure, but that's up to you, because if we as a society decide that 20 hours a week is fair, then, or 15 hours a week, or whatever it is, 25 hours, although I think that's too high still, I think it should be about 20, 15, 20. Then, because we need some level of production, we need some buildings built and some services provided, or we won't have those things in society. So we need to have some people work where it can't be done by robots and machines and technology. We're going to have some element of that. But I'm going off on one now, but fundamentally the nationalising, the bringing under public control and profit sharing of the major public network, major public utilities, major natural resources and so forth, like, how we could have nationalised our waterways is insane. It's a natural monopoly. It is a totally natural monopoly. You're not going to have other companies put water pipes in the ground. It's just insane that we would do this, that would create a completely fake market, and give the profits and control to private companies. No thanks, absolutely not. They need to be brought under democratic control and run in the public interest, not for profit, run in the public interest, and fundamentally, then bring about a change to society. In these major public institutions that we've brought under our control, they will set the standard for what all other organisations that are permitted to exist must operate under, and they will be operated under a system of councils, as I said, with representatives from the general public, from the workers, and from trade unions, and from elected representatives in government. And we would set a plan together in what we want to have produced, and we would, as best as possible that we could do, and we would run these industries in the general interests on the principles of worker self-management, democracy through election of any management and board and so forth, with working much less hours and producing possibly less than we do now, and with a principle that everything is egalitarian, as shared to the extent that it can be. And that would set the standard. That means Sky would be completely democratised, take it off Murdoch. That would mean Virgin would be completely democratised, take it off the senior management and shareholders of Virgin. It would mean that all of our natural resources would be under our control, all of our transport and energy networks and so forth, and we would have a far more egalitarian, far more better society where people would want to work, when where going to work would not mean being bullied off bad management in private company, but would mean you've elected the management and you've had a say over how that company runs because you made that profit and you worked for that profit. You generated the labour and productivity for that company. You did it. So because you did that, you should have control because you did it. You participated. Whether you're working on a ship, whether you're working for the national grid, whether you're on a site building a school, you did that as a worker. Don't let anyone else tell you differently. You, as a worker, generated the profit, or if we don't use profit, then you generated the productivity. So you, as a human being, should be permitted to have democratic control to the extent that you're affected by the decisions. You should have decision making of that. And we would also, when we move to a communist society, where we bring those major institutions under our control, we would also set up another political system, essentially, that also brings decision making much further down to the local level, which will mean an increasing of political participation. So in your community, you might be a member of another citizen council that decides what's produced in your area and decides what's built in your area and how we spend funding, not just having one massive council for hundreds of thousands of people that is not completely democratic and relying on representatives that are persuaded by private companies to not vote in your interest. And so political decision making, whilst we also alter these national commanding heights, we would also bring decision making to the lowest level possible to democratise society, to stop the whole centralisation of Parliament controlling everything. It would be through a system of councils that are made up, and you'd send delegates to regional councils and you would share decision making on certain issues. So some issues would be a national issue, and maybe for certain national issues, like you'd have a referendum, we would have a vote, everyone would. But for some issues that are regional, you'd have a regional council that you've elected to, they would have a decision over that. But for other decisions, they would be decided by local politics, by what you've decided in your citizen council in your area, which will be a lot smaller than, say, Salford Council or Manchester Council or whatever. So, and you would be regularly meeting with people in your council to discuss issues, and all information would be shared. And we would not be living under, I don't think, what you'd call a market economy, because, the major institutions of society would be brought under our control in a non-market fashion. So not like as they existed previously in the 60s and 70s, where they were at arm's length, they were only to some degree controlled and planned, only to a small degree. We still shared in the profit better because they were owned by us. So we didn't have fat cat shareholders ripping the dividends out and all that. But they weren't really democratised to the extent, in any capacity, in my opinion, as a communist socialist would want them to be. But I've tried to explain what the commanding heights are in our society. They are essentially the top 150 to 200 companies in the land now, which has changed from what they were 40, 50 years ago, where they would have been more things like British Steel, British Gas, coal and so forth, and the railways and British Airways and Rolls-Royce. But now maybe they would still be included, but the biggest companies in Britain now are things like Amazon, are things like Virgin, Sky. They would all be included. Barclays, Lloyds and so forth. Those banks, they're all being brought under our control, because they have to be, because without bringing them under control, we still have a privatised, disastrous, capitalist craphole system. Without bringing the major economic activity under our control through a system of councils, means we live under a fundamentally privatised society. So it doesn't make a difference if we have a few companies or small companies that are cooperatives. Yes, that's good, but it's not the same as taking where the main economic activity occurs. In those Amazon workplaces now, in the factories where the wage slaves work, in Sky News, in in Virgin, where Virgin has control of our fibre network and that, and BT, British Telecom, we need to take that back. So without taking them back, we are going to be we're not tackling the crucial things which are the commanding heights, and that's why the commanding heights have to be brought back under our control. They have to be. It's a fundamental thing that we need to do, and we need to control them, as I've just said, far more democratically and far more in a socialist communist style, where we plan society as best as we can. And we give democratic control to your voice, you as a citizen and you as a worker who generated the profit and who's affected by the decisions. And the fundamental getting control of these companies is gonna enable us to transform society. That's why you need to tell everyone that we need to live under a socialist communist society, that this market economy that we live under is a disaster, and that we can live under a democratic system that is far more fairer and far better than the crap one we live under now. There's no need to be suffering in a crap job with small pay, without any time for leisure, with 40 hours a week. That is something that's been brainwashed into you through the whole system, through being a child, through growing up in the education system, through your peers, through the media, through celebrities. This is a lie that is put onto you. It is a lie that you have to work for 40 hours a week as a wage slave. It's a lie that we have to have a market economy that largely controls everything. It's a total lie that we have to have these things. We can have a planned society, or at least a much more egalitarian and fairer society where the major economic institutions are under our control. We can have that. It's a choice. Don't let anyone else tell you differently. It is a fact. And I believe if enough people are turned on and woken up, as Jeremy Corbyn tried his best to do 6 years ago, where he inspired millions of people in this country to wake up against the 40 years of neoliberal disaster that has wrecked Britain. He turned a lot of people on and woke up, and that is to his massive credit, even if I don't completely agree with him on everything. To the extent that he was a great socialist leader of our time, of my lifetime, he is. And he showed me that there are enough people in Britain that do think like this. My feeling is that on economic issues like this, the general public, if it was explained to them, would largely agree with what I've just said. But on some social issues like hanging or other types of issues like that, they are possibly to the right, and immigration and that kind of thing, they are possibly further to the right than me. And that's fine, that's up to them, that's a choice. But I think on the crucial core economic issues like nationalisation and so forth, I think the vast majority of people agree that society is far too privatised and the market is far too powerful to claim that we live under a democracy. I believe democracy is a fraud. I think that there's no such thing as democracy with capitalism. How can we claim that we have control and participation, which is what democracy means, when the vast majority of institutions in our life are out of our control, other than through regulators and the limited amount through legislation that we can control them? And when you go to work, whether that's the NHS, whether that's a major bank, whether that's a major Tesco's, whether that's a major supermarket, you're basically a wage slave. You're a total wage slave. You rent yourself. You don't have any participation in the election of management of the company policies. You are a pathetic wage slave. And to claim that we have democracy when 40 hours a week you're a pathetic wage slave, and when the major institutions in society are not democratically controlled under any type of planned socialism, means that democracy cannot exist with a capitalist system of private tyrannies, because that's exactly what occurs in this country. It is private tyranny. And the more people that wake up and realise this, the sooner we can change to a communist system. we have to get the Tory scum out of our government. We have to get them out of the government. These mental, fascist, right-wing crackpots will never bring about a communist system. We can bring it about. I believe it can even be reformed. I could be wrong, and possibly it needs a much more stronger revolution, but I think that it's possible we could, to some degree, reform society, and fundamentally the first steps is nationalising the commanding heights. Thanks for watching my video.